Hello and welcome back to my channel. For this video, I wanted to do an art related Q&A. I asked for questions over on Instagram, Threads, and here on YouTube, and I've consolidated every response I received and will answer them shortly. Before I get to that, I wanted to say that I got some really good questions, and many of them made me think harder than I anticipated, particularly about my process. But I'm glad because I was able to really think about why I do what I do. But so I have enough time to answer every question. Let me get started. The first question is from Durwood on Instagram, who asks, are portraits your preferred subject to paint? Do you have others? Funny story about this is that I've always wanted to be good at drawing faces, but I used to be so worried that the face wouldn't look like the person I was portraying that I would actually draw everything but the face. So I would draw the whole body and the face would just be a blank oval. This was back in high school. I eventually did finally learn how to draw faces that in a way that worked for me. But it was when I did the 100 Heads Challenge that I finally got the appropriate practice for drawing almost any face and facial expression. But to answer the question, yes, I do prefer portraits as my primary subject, and I include humans and animals in that because I love doing animal portraits as well. But I also have entire sketchbook spreads where I draw random objects and combine them in one composition. So I like to learn to draw pretty much anything because I think that makes you a better artist to be able to break any subject down to its basic shapes and be able to draw it. But I prefer painting portraits the most. The next question is from Penny Raven on Threads, who asked, what tips have you got for noses and lips? No matter gender or race, they always just look like I've got the perspective wrong. Okay, I'm going to do my best without having an appropriate demo available. But how I draw basically anything is to not look at it as like a nose or lips or a rabbit or a watermelon. I look at them as a shape. I start with a basic shape and then break that shape down into smaller shapes. So if I'm drawing like a nose in profile, I don't see a nose, I see a triangle. I see lips basically as like a bisected oval. From there, I carve out the individual parts. Like I follow the silhouette, the nostrils, the nose bridge. For the lips, I'll basically draw the seam of the mouth where the two lips meet. I'll draw that first and then draw the upper and lower lip accordingly. It's hard to explain without actually doing a demo, but this scrunched up face in this portrait was both a challenge and extremely fun to draw because I had to take the eyes and the eyebrows into consideration, but try not to complicate the initial basic shape first, okay? Remember the nose is a triangle. It's even a triangle if you look at it from the front. Start there and then try to carve the silhouette from there. The next question is from Bar Keegan on Instagram, who asked, do you reckon you use more reference from life or other sources? Okay, so I do draw from photo reference, mostly my own, and sometimes from life if I actually have time to sit and draw what's in front of me. I do have a full-time job and a kid, and so if I see something I want to draw and I don't have time to sketch right then, I take a few photos and I draw them on my downtime. One of my favorite things to do is to actually take my DSLR to my local zoo and photograph the animals. 90%, probably more, of my animal drawings are from my own photos because I have literally thousands of them from over the years. Plus, my zoo has been having babies left and right, so I love going and photographing the tiger cubs, and we just had a new giraffe and baby bongo and red pandas. I love my zoo. So basically, yes, I love taking my own references and drawing them because it makes the memory of that photo that much more special for me, be able to draw it. Next, Laura Jean Art on Threads asked, have you always loved your current mediums, and are there other mediums or styles that you dived into on the way to finding your current medium? Okay, so I was in an art program from elementary through high school, and in the 8 years I was in that program, we did watercolor one time, and I hated it. I now understand that I probably hated it because A, We didn't spend enough time learning the ins and outs of the medium, like water control, brush technique, pigment properties, and the different kinds of watercolor paper. I also now understand why we didn't learn it as intricately as we did like acrylic, because watercolor is mad expensive, and I went to a public school. So I avoided watercolor like the plague until 2021, when I again watched some other YouTube artists use watercolor in a way that I never realized it could be used outside of landscapes and florals. Now I pretty much think watercolor is the best medium in the world, and I'm fully addicted. The next question comes from the amazing illustrator Charlene Draws, who asked, which paints, sketchbooks, brushes do you like best for your watercolors and why? Before I get to the actual painting supplies, I want to talk first about my pencils. For my sketches, I use pretty much any 2H pencil for the blocking sketch, although I've mostly been using like a Faber-Castell 2H graphite pencil. And then I use a black wing. I think the one I'm using here is the black wing natural, but I have 602s, I have the pearls, I have, I really like those black wing pencils. I use those for the final detail sketch. And I use the black wing because it's dark enough to still see under the layers of watercolor, but it doesn't smudge very much when I apply that initial layer of water. I use that to seal the sketch in before I start painting. But yes, those are my sketching materials. My sketchbook, which is my favorite sketchbook that I've ever used, is the Cobalt Pro Sketcher. And this particular one is hot press, 300 GSM, 50% cotton, Fabriano 5 paper. I was actually surprised by how much I love the sketchbook because it's only 50% cotton, but it's so perfect for my drawing and painting style that I actually struggle with other papers because they won't do what this paper does when I throw paint on it. Like I still love using like the Etcher Everyday sketchbook, the cold press one, or the etchers that have the Fabriano Artistico paper, the perfect signature sketchbooks. But this particular one, this Cobalt Pro Sketcher, the texture is perfect. It's not too smooth. It has just enough tooth to actually grab onto the graphite and color pencil. Like it doesn't slide, the pencil doesn't slide across the paper too smoothly. And I've also noticed that my paint colors don't shift as much on this paper as it does on like cold press paper. It does, of course, the pigments are going to lighten as they dry, but I guess because the paint doesn't sink into the paper like it does with cold press, it kind of sits on top of the paper for longer, that the paints remain a little bit more vibrant as they would on cold press paper. So I don't have to layer as much as I would on cold press paper. Plus it dries pretty flat as long as I keep the binder clips on until it fully dries. Now for the paint. My favorite paints are hands down the Da Vinci watercolors. They are so high quality and relatively affordable compared to other professional brands. They have 8 milliliter tubes for as low as $6, and they have 37 milliliter tubes for the same price as one Daniel Smith 15 milliliter tube. I'm actually using 2 curated sets by Denise Soden in liquid color, if you've heard of her, that she did in collaboration with them. The Earth Friendly palette and the Embrace Opacity palettes. These 2 palettes together are perfect for me in the way I paint, especially the Earth Friendly palette because it has so many spectral colors and earth colors that they're great for portraits. And I especially love it because there are colors in here that I would have never thought to use for color mixing for skin tones, like the gold ochre and the green gold, mixing those with the alizarin crimson or the red rose deep. Plus, the one I still have the original, so it still has the quinacridone burnt orange. I just love this palette. It's like I model anytime I buy other paint, I model those palettes based on this particular palette. And now finally, my brushes. So actually right here I'm using my Escoda size 16 brush. My Escoda brushes are my favorite brushes that I use, but I also use the silver black velvet sometimes, and I use like my Polina Bright quill brush. I love the Escodas because they maintain their point. Like, this is a very large brush, but it has great snap and it maintains its point, so I can still get like nice details even with such a large brush. The silver black velvets are softer, but they don't really disturb the layers underneath when you glaze over with them. And then the Polina Bright just gives great coverage with the washes because of how much water it holds without shedding any hairs onto your painting. This next question is actually right on time. It comes from the amazing Laylee Illustrations, who asked, how do you approach painting loosely? I feel like when you lay your watercolor on the page, you just let it go where it wants. I think it would be helpful to know what goes on in your head as you paint. And then she also put, love, love, love your work and your art style. And this also coincides with the next question from the lovely Brandywine, who asked, I really struggle with layering and not making things muddy. Your colors blend so beautifully and seem to maintain their definition when needed and combined when warranted. Is there a secret to this? So as far as why I paint loosely, the thing is I actually do want the paints to do whatever they are going to do. I started painting this way so I can get out of my own head and stop worrying about quote unquote ruining a sketch. So what I do is I really dilute the paint so that it's basically more water than pigment in the first few layers. And I place the highlights where they go, and then the shadows, and then I dot in those mid-tones, which is what you see me doing right now. And I basically go back and forth doing this, lifting paint from areas like with a paper towel, and I do that to maintain the highlights. But I still let the paint take the wheel in these first layers until I see where I'm at, and then once those layers dry, I start to rein in more control, but I'm guided by where those initial layers landed. And this approach made me so much less afraid to paint, and it made the process way more fun for me. So as far as there being a secret, that really is the secret. You want to make sure your initial layers are super light and transparent, and you want them to be intentional as well as to where you're placing those colors. My color palette is also super simple. You see I'm using the primary triad. It's always going to be a yellow, a blue, and a red. Doing this helps me to avoid mud because wherever any two of those colors touch will just create a secondary color. And I try not to introduce the third color because when you mix all three colors, that's where you get a brown. You don't want to introduce that third color until that second layer has either completely dried or at least has soaked into the paper enough so that it doesn't mix that mud. I don't know if I'm explaining that right. So if I place a blue for a shadow and then a yellow for a highlight, I try not to introduce the red in that area because obviously the blue and the yellow are going to make a green. If you introduce that red too soon, it's going to create a brown when you don't want that brown introduced just yet. It's the same as if I drop a red and a yellow next to each other. I try to avoid adding a blue until those layers have sunk into the paper. This helps to maintain the vibrancy of those mixes as well as the glaze when you add that third color. You can help speed up the drying process with a hair dryer on low heat, or you can play Mario Kart like I do with my kid until those layers dry. But the actual secret is basically patience. Durwood also asked, how did you start painting portraits? Did you take a course? So I had painted portraits with oil pastels and acrylic. I even used the lino cut ink for a large portrait before. But and I also did digital art in the early 2000s when Photoshop was really starting to take off. But I started with watercolor back in 2021 after I learned that art YouTube was even a thing. And I started following a few artists like Just Carp and I'm a Wonder and I love the way that they use watercolor for illustrations and portraits. But how I really learned what worked for me was by doing the 100 Heads Challenge in 2022 and using some of those heads for watercolor practice. If you want to see those heads, I can make a video about that, but let me know in the comments. I'd actually recorded every single head and posted them all on my TikTok. But anyway, during the 100 heads, I used that challenge as a way for me to practice my portrait painting. And they were small enough so that I can really establish basically how to mix skin tones and where, it's gonna sound weird, but where to place the paint as far as shadows and highlights. My goal was to take the complication out of it. I wanted to really try to simplify it because I was, up until that point, I was avoiding painting portraits, but I was like, I'm never going to learn if I don't actually practice. So I used that 100 heads challenge, and I found a way that worked for me. And it worked for me for a while until, again, I got too much in my head and I stopped painting faces for a long time. And I finally had to break down in one of my later sketchbooks and was like, you know what, I'm just going to throw the paint on the page and see what happens. I started doing that so that I can get out of my head about ruining the sketch. If I paint the page first and then draw the sketch, then I'm not ruining the sketch. I'm actually just using the paint as background. Once I got out of my head that way, then I was able to do that process in reverse. Draw the sketch, throw the paint on, let it see where the paint lands, and then doing that made me realize that, you know what? This is way more fun than I've been making it previously. This is why in several of my portraits, you'll see me splattering the page first, seeing where those blobs land, and then figuring out the process from there. The next question comes from my friend Gabriel Whitney on Threads, who asked, do you have any art heroes? Artists you loved growing up or go back to again and again for inspiration? I will say that I don't have specific art heroes that I remember growing up admiring, but I will say that a lot of my sketching style is greatly influenced by American comic books. I was a huge comic book nerd back in the, well, I would say this before I had a kid and the hobby got too expensive. Of course, I swapped that hobby out for another expensive hobby, which is collecting watercolors. But American comic books, because I love superhero comics. I'm a huge Superman fan. And the art style, especially the pencils, the pencilers, like Jim Lee, Michael Turner. I like the way they shaded areas so that the inker will know which areas to ink in all black. But I adopted that shading style in the way that I render my sketches before I paint. So I will say that that was a great influence on even my style today. As far as now, there are a lot of artists that I greatly admire and who have had an influence on me as far as just continuing my practice. And it's not so much their actual style, just more their energy gives me gives me more motivation to continue doing what I'm doing. And that's like Denise Soden. She does amazing animal portraits, but it's really how she taught me basically how to color mix and the importance of knowing pigment information and being able to choose the right color combinations. Jess Karp is another artist who has had a direct influence on me because she taught me the importance of showing up on the page and maintaining a regular practice, and also learning the importance of diversifying your subject matter. She draws pretty much everything, and I've learned that knowing how to draw more than one type of subject greatly improves your skills in the subject that you actually want to draw. So like I may be a I may be primarily a portrait artist, but knowing how to draw animals, landscapes, basic shapes helps me improve in my portraiture. I also really like watching Ham Rib's videos. She paints a completely different style than I do, but I like watching portrait watercolor artists. Even though she does gouache more so, but she is very skilled with watercolors as well. Gabriel asked another question. He asked, "Have you ever considered telling a story with your art, such as picture book, comic, illustrations for a book, etc.?" I wanted to answer this question because I wanted to clear up any misconceptions about the type of art that I do. I will do singular illustrations every once in a while. I primarily like to paint portraits, but as much as I love illustrative style art, which is actually my favorite style of art, as I mentioned, I love comic books. I love kidlit illustrations. That's some of my favorite type of art. But I personally do not want to be an illustrator, at least not for full-on picture books or anything that has to do with any type of sequential art. I like doing like single one-off like editorial type illustrations. But I don't want to draw the same character throughout a narrative. That's not the type of art I want to do personally. Plus, I don't want art to be my full-time job. I have a full-time job. I don't like my full-time job, but it pays the bills. It does what it's supposed to do. I use art as a way to relax. Usually when people ask if I illustrate kids' books, or if I want to illustrate kids' books, or will I illustrate their kids' books, I usually try to deflect. I don't really like having to explain myself in this area because people seem to get offended that I don't want to be a kid's book illustrator. But I like doing art for fun. Making it work will take all the fun out of it, and I won't want to do it anymore. Because now you're taking the thing that relaxes me and you're turning it into the thing that's going to stress me out. So I would rather just keep my art life and my work life completely separate. It's the thing I do after work. It's the thing I do on the weekends. I'm not trying to work on the weekends. The next question comes from KG Dub, who asked, "What pencils or pens do you use for detail work on your watercolors?" Okay, so this is another easy question. So I mentioned before that I use which graphite pencils I use for the initial sketch. And I mentioned that I use them because it helps me to maintain the sketch underneath the watercolors. As you can see, you can still definitely see the sketch. And I personally like the way that looks in watercolor portraits. And so what I do, after I've completed well, there may be some layers after this, but after I complete the most important layers, I go in with color pencils. These are Faber-Castell Polychromos color pencils. These pencils are oil-based, so they're really made for blending. They actually blend in with the watercolors almost seamlessly, unless you get up really close. This is probably the only method that I've maintained from my previous painting style, because I just prefer the way color pencil line art looks over ink or even watercolor detail. The color pencil gives it a much softer look, than an ink line drawing to me. And I don't have steady enough hands for watercolor line work, so I choose the color pencils because it doesn't it's not so jarring. It looks like it's part of the watercolor painting. It was actually John Drawing, another artist that I love his work. He was the first artist I saw using color pencil in addition to his watercolor illustrations. He used the color pencils for line work and for adding additional values on top of the watercolor. And that was a revelation to me, and so I adopted that into my style. And the final question comes from El Gato Sketches, who asked, do you have any tips for getting better at watercolor? So I think one of the best ways to get better at watercolor is to literally play with your paints. Practice color mixing, make color mixing charts and value charts. Do little quick doodles next to your charts so you can practice the mixes that you created in those charts. And you want to practice those mixes with varying levels of saturation, transparency, and value. For example, let's say you're mixing different purples. You want to draw like a little sketch. Maybe draw like a little blueberry or some grapes. Just not something complicated. And then practice those mixes onto that little sketch. So what this will do will help you to get to know your colors better, but practicing color mixing will also help with water control, which is something that I think a lot of the beginners, including myself, struggle with at first. Plus, you'll see how your paints look when they're dry, and then you'll know just how much paint to lay down layer by layer. But you also want to get some samples of different types of watercolor paper and see which ones that you vibe with the best, because different papers will react to the paint differently. Finding this out on the front end will save you some headaches and some money in the long run. If I had known from the beginning that my favorite watercolor paper would be 50% cotton, hot press, Fabriano 5 paper, rather than like a lot of people love Arches or Arch, I don't know how you pronounce it, which is usually 100% cotton. And they love the cold press. It took me a long time to figure out I don't like cold press paper. I do like the hot press Fabriano Artistico and the cold press Etcher Everyday, but those are the only two other papers that I've actually had success with personally. But you want to find this out about the paper ahead of time, because I wouldn't have bought all those other sketchbooks if I had known that, because I wound up only using them for swatching anyway, which was a waste of time and money. Not a waste of time, but it was a waste of money. Another thing you have to recognize is that you will not be a pro in 1 week. I'm still learning things about this medium, and I'm on year 3. So have patience with the medium and yourself. You can also do what I did to finally let loose and just throw the paint on the paper first. And then you can draw on top of that dried paint. Watercolor really is a fun medium if you acknowledge that sometimes it just doesn't want to be controlled. Just let it do what it wants to do. So that is all the questions. And we are also almost at the end of this video. I really want to thank everyone that replied, because it gave me something to talk about, since I'm learning that a lot of you like the chatty videos. If you couldn't tell, I rarely feel like talking unless I'm prompted, so this was actually really helpful. Anyway, I'm going to head out and try to fill another sketchbook spread, but in the meantime, please drink some water, Get some rest, and if you feel up to it, try to draw for 15 minutes today. And I will see you in the next video. And as my favorite YouTuber always says, happy painting!